In this section, we'll look at the procedures required to keep a chainsaw running smoothly and the sorts of things you need to look out for to avoid serious problems from developing. The topics we'll cover are powerhead maintenance, guide bar maintenance, and chain sharpening. The powerhead is the body of the chainsaw. Here's a basic checklist for carrying out a daily service on the powerhead. At the end of each day's work, you should dust down the outside of the powerhead with a cloth or brush. Check the chain catcher to make sure that it's firmly fixed and not damaged, and that the throttle control and on-off switch are operating normally. Take off the side cover and remove the chain and guide bar. Clean around the clutch and drive sprocket with cleaning fluid and check the components for wear or damage. Be careful when you're cleaning around the oil outlet for the guide bar to make sure no particles block up the hole. Clean out the inside of the cover, especially around the brake band if that's where it's fitted. Also check the brake band for wear or damage. Take off the top cover and clean the inside, including around the spark plug and the cooling fins on the motor, and check the spark plug lead to make sure that it's firmly in place. Take off the air filter and tap out the dust. If it's still dirty, soak it in a solution recommended by the manufacturer. If it's damaged, replace it with a new one. Finally, check any other fittings to make sure they're secure and undamaged. A more extensive periodic maintenance needs to be carried out every 80 hours of chainsaw use. This is most likely to be done by the maintenance staff at your workplace or the local dealer. During this service, the mechanic will check the spark plug by examining the gap and making sure the connection is sound. Replace the fuel filter if it's clogged, and wash out the fuel tank if necessary. Remove the fan housing and clean the fan blades. Check the anti-vibration mountings for looseness or deterioration. Check the drive sprocket for wear and replace it if necessary. Some manufacturers recommend that the drive sprocket be replaced every time you fit a new chain. The sprocket bearings also need to be greased at regular intervals. And if the motor isn't running properly, the mechanic will also check the carburetor and adjust the idle and high and low speed jets if required. Before we leave the powerhead maintenance, let's look at the two basic types of drive sprockets that you're likely to come across. A spur or fixed sprocket is permanently attached to the clutch drum, so when it needs to be replaced, the whole drum is replaced. A rim or floating sprocket, on the other hand, slides onto a hub which is welded to the clutch drum, which means that you can replace it separately. The guide bar needs to be in a sound condition to allow the chain to run through it smoothly at high speed, particularly when it's under a heavy load while it's cutting. Here's a checklist for the daily service you need to carry out on the guide bar. Clean out the groove all the way around, paying particular attention to the oil holes and the sprocket nose. Check that the sprocket nose rotates smoothly. Each time you put the guide bar back on the saw, turn the bar over to help even up the wear on both sides. The best way to remind yourself which way the bar should go is to look at the writing on it before you take it off and see whether it's the right way up or upside down. Like the powerhead, the periodic maintenance on the guide bar should also be done every 80 hours of chainsaw use, where either you or your maintenance person should grease the nose sprocket if it's recommended by the manufacturer, remove any burrs on the edges with a flat file or a sharpening stone, and check that the rails are even and that there isn't excessive wear in the groove that would make the chain sloppy. Now let's look at chains. There are different designs and sizes for chains, with particular ones being used for certain types of cutting and different saw and guide bar sizes. However, all chains have the same basic components. The cutter has a top plate and a side plate, both of which are sharpened at the front to a fine edge. The area where they meet is called the working corner, because it's where the cutting action begins. The depth gauge at the front of the cutter controls the amount of wood taken out at each bite, and is set at a height that allows the cutter to remove just the right amount of wood for the maximum efficiency. Right and left cutters are positioned alternately along the chain to enable the saw to cut evenly, with tie straps and drive links in between attached with rivets. Each drive link has a tang at the bottom which allows the sprocket to drive it forward. The hook at the front is also designed to pick up oil for lubrication in the bar groove, and to keep the groove clean as it runs through. Reduced kickback chains have some form of ramp on the drive link or the leading edge of the depth gauge, to help guide obstacles smoothly over the top of the depth gauge. Chain sharpening needs to be done frequently, such as every time you fill the tank with petrol. But you may need to do it more often than that, especially if you're cutting through a log containing dirt or a termite pipe, or if the cutters accidentally hit the ground while the chain's still moving. The telltale signs that your chain needs sharpening are the sawdust produced goes from small chips to a fine powder, you need to apply more force than usual to get through the cut, or the saw starts to run off in the cut. Before we look in detail at sharpening techniques, we need to talk about the 3 basic profiles of cutters available, because this will affect the way you sharpen them. The round or chipper profile has a large cutting corner, which helps it to stay sharp for longer, but makes the cutting speed slower. The square or chisel cutter has a very fine cutting corner, so it cuts faster, but is more easily blunted by abrasive materials. The semi-square or semi-chisel profile is a compromise between the round and square profiles in terms of its cutting speed and its ability to stay sharp. The file size you use and the cutting angles you work with will be determined by the profile you're using and also what pitch the chain is. Pitch is measured by taking the distance between 3 consecutive rivets and halving it. Naturally, the pitch is always going to be the same for the drive sprocket and the nose sprocket. The filing angles will be set by the manufacturer. Top plates are often filed at between 25 to 30 degrees, and the side plate is generally filed either flat or with a 10-degree tilt, depending on the profile you're using. But always check with the chain manufacturer's specifications before you start to sharpen your own chain. The easiest way to file cutters by hand is to use a vise and a file holder or gauge. The vise can either be a bench vise, if you're in a workshop, or a stump vise, if you're out in the forest. There are different types of file holders around, so you can choose the one you feel most comfortable with, and follow the directions on how to use it. Here's some general hints on filing cutters. Use a full-length stroke, filing from the inside to the outside, and file until you've removed all of the damage from the top plate and the side plate. Make sure that the file holder rests on both the top plate and the depth gauge. Work around the chain, skipping every second cutter so that you're only filing the cutters that face the same way, and then change sides to do the other set of cutters. Try to keep the left-hand and right-hand cutters the same length, so the chain doesn't develop a chatter or excessive vibration when it's cutting, or start to cut unevenly. If the chain is oily, cut some dry wood to clean the chain off before you start filing. Each time you sharpen the cutters, they'll get a little bit lower in relation to the depth gauges. For this reason, you'll need to file down the depth gauges periodically, probably every 3rd or 4th sharpen. Again, the settings you use will depend on the type of chain you're using and the wood you're cutting. Remember that the depth gauge setting is crucial to maintaining good performance with your saw, so you need to check them regularly. If your workplace has maintenance staff that do all the general saw maintenance and chain sharpening, you don't need to worry so much about the periodic servicing. But you still have to be just as careful with the daily safety checks and chain tensioning. Because in the end, you're the operator, so you're responsible for making sure the saw is running properly. And of course, it goes without saying that if something goes wrong while you're using it, you'll be the one that has to cope with the sudden emergency.